All right, here's where we left off in the last video as we talked about the importance of context in determining the outcome. And of course, the outcome we're interested in is the contents of the Constitution. So in the previous lecture video, we focused on the fact that the most important aspect of the context of 1787 that leads to the Constitutional Convention, that leads to the writing of the new Constitution, that leads to the ratification of the Constitution, that leads to us living under that Constitution today. The most important factor is that there were problems. So the men at the Constitutional Convention, they're there to solve problems. 55 men showed up to solve problems. And what we see in the process of them attempting to solve problems is we see that these men were, in some respects, united, right? They were united by their common goals to solve specific problems. And in this video, we're going to talk about what those specific problems were. And they were also united in their common goal to promote common values. They wanted a system of government that reflected those democratic values, those democratic principles that we talked about previously and will continue to talk about. However, the context also reflects that there were deep conflicts of interest among these men. These 55 men did not agree on everything. The Constitutional Convention takes place over a 3.5-month long period. You may be aware that the Constitution is a fairly brief document. The Constitution basically is, in terms of its length, it's like a pamphlet, whereas other constitutions of the world, they might be as long as a phone book, an old school phone book in the United States. So it's a brief document. And so why would it take 3.5 months to write such a brief document? Well, that's because there were problems. That's because there were disagreements. But at the end of the day, by the middle of September, by September 17th, the men are in agreement that they should do more than simply amend the Articles of Confederation, that they need a brand new document. And of course, over the preceding 3.5 months, they had designed such a government. So they had met in daily sessions, 6 days a week, a morning session, an afternoon session, and an evening session, 6 days a week. They took some time off to celebrate the July 4th holiday. They took time off to meet together in committees to work on specific drafts of specific parts of the Constitution. And then ultimately, in mid-September, they have the completed document. And every provision in the Constitution was voted on multiple times at the convention. So what we have is a document that was voted on September 17th. They were voting on whether or not to approve that Constitution and present that Constitution to the states for ratification. Now, I mentioned previously that the Articles of Confederation required unanimous agreement from the states before any changes could be made to the Articles of Confederation. Well, the way the framers got around that, because getting unanimous consent on anything of great import is not going to achieve unanimity. And so what the framers did at the Constitutional Convention is they changed the rules. And they decided that since they could not get unanimous consent, they were going to settle for a supermajority. In other words, at the convention, if you could get a simple majority of the states at the convention, if you get a simple majority of them to agree to a provision, then that provision could go into the Constitution. And then ultimately, the ratification of the Constitution required 3/4 of the states. Okay, so they sort of changed the rules once they got to the convention. But ultimately, it was up to the states to decide. Were the individual states willing to accept this new Constitution that had been written? Were they willing to replace the Articles of Confederation? So let's take a look at where the framers in the Constitution tell us why they didn't merely amend the Articles of Confederation, why instead they designed a brand new document. And they do that in one of the most well-known passages of the Constitution. Perhaps you had to memorize this in 8th grade when you studied the Constitution. Basically, there's a place in the Constitution where the framers list their common goals. They list their reasons for writing a new Constitution and for presenting that new Constitution for ratification by the states. And some of you may already be thinking, yep, that part of the Constitution is the preamble. So, it doesn't hurt to remind ourselves of what's in the preamble. The 6 goals are, as the preamble begins, we the people of the United States, in order to, and then the 6 goals are listed. And if you remember them, say them along with me out loud. Form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and the 6th goal, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. And then the preamble ends to complete the sentence with, we do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So in the preamble, basically what the framers of the Constitution are telling us, they're telling us that the reason they've created this new government with this new Constitution is because these 6 goals could not be achieved without the new Constitution. Another way of saying that is, under the Articles of Confederation, these goals could not be achieved. So let's talk about the problems. Let's talk about the problems that existed in America that undermined the formation of a more perfect union, that undermined the establishment of justice, that undermined domestic tranquility. So I'm just going to go through these again as a way of illustrating the fact that the Constitution is an attempt to solve problems and to achieve and promote common values. So form a more perfect union is a reference to, as it suggests, binding the states together. Under the Articles of Confederation, each state was sovereign and independent. That was a problem. Under the Articles of Confederation, states were made sovereign and independent because they wanted to be free of tyranny. And they thought the best way to be free of tyranny was to move far, far away from centralized government power, move far, far away from the kind of rule that the king had, that the colonial governors had, move far, far away from that, and put the power in the hands of the states. Let each state govern itself. That was the way to prevent tyranny. Well, that didn't work out. That sort of approach to government was not working out. The states were not unified. States had a lot of disputes with each other, and they were not able to come together to unify as one people. Americans thought of themselves as Virginians before they thought of themselves as Americans. Americans thought of themselves as New Yorkers before they thought of themselves as Americans. Their citizenship was defined in their minds as citizens of states. And so what the framers of the Constitution wanted to do was address that problem and find a governing document that would actually promote more union, promote more unity within the country. The second goal of establishing justice. This is a reference to having the rule of law under the Articles of Confederation. There were no national courts. And of course, courts are where we seek to achieve justice quite often. But the problem was states had their own courts, but there were no national courts. Again, each state was sovereign and independent. So what do you do when states have conflicts with each other? What do you do when states have disputes with each other, like Pennsylvania and Virginia did when they were sending their own people into unsettled frontier lands and telling those people that they can settle those lands. Well, Pennsylvania was claiming the same land as Virginia. And so actually Pennsylvania and Virginia went to war with each other under the Articles of Confederation in order to settle that dispute. So the framers said, no, we need national courts so that there will be a mechanism to adjudicate disputes among the states. So that couldn't happen under the Articles of Confederation, because under the Articles of Confederation, each state was sovereign. No external authority could tell a state how to govern itself. Each state was independent. They could govern themselves however they wanted without respect to what the other states were doing. That was not working. So establishing justice was a goal of the framers. Ensuring domestic tranquility. This is a reference to basically keeping the peace within the United States, right? Establishing and maintaining the rule of law. You may remember from 8th grade or from high school, you may remember discussion of Shays' Rebellion. This was one of the most important events in the context leading up to the Constitutional Convention. Because in 1786, Daniel Shays, a Revolutionary War veteran, led other fellow veterans and citizens of Massachusetts, led them in an uprising against the policies of the state of Massachusetts. They were rebelling against foreclosures on their farms. These were men who, as farmers, were suffering great harm due to the policies of their state. So they decided that they were simply going to rise up against their state and prevent the state from enforcing foreclosures on their land. The men were harmed. They didn't have the money to pay their debts, and so their land, their home was being seized. So these men decided to rise up. And they started off, with a little band of men with pickaxes and shovels. Eventually, they break into an armory and get guns, and they basically rampage across the state of Massachusetts for 10 months. The governor has no ability. The governor has no ability to put down this rebellion. There were no police forces. There was no existing state militia in Massachusetts. And so the only way this rebellion was put down was by a wealthy individual putting forth the money to hire a private militia to put down the rebellion. And so, of course, national leaders did not want mercenary militias to become the mechanism for deciding how America was to be ruled. So they wanted to ensure that there was adequate power of government to enforce the laws and to prevent the people from rebelling against laws that they didn't like. A fourth goal that could not be met under the Articles of Confederation is providing for the common defense. And this is a lot more straightforward, right? Common defense refers to defending the United States from foreign threats. So all 13 states in common had an interest in being protected from the British coming back and trying to reclaim the colonies. They all had an interest in preventing Spain from trying to, that did have land holdings on the American continent. They wanted to prevent Spain from being able to come in and try to take over as a colonial ruler of these new 13 fledgling states. And even Native Americans were a threat because, of course, American colonists were infringing increasingly on the lands of Native peoples, and those Native peoples were being encouraged by the British to take up arms against colonists. So the problem for the United States was that there was no national army. The U.S. Revolutionary Forces disbanded after independence was gained. There was no longer a national militia. State militias had gone home and had largely disbanded. There was no national army. There was no national navy. Basically, the United States was quite vulnerable to attack. And under the Articles of Confederation, the national government simply didn't have the power to tax, to raise money, to form militia, to form a national militia, a national army, a national navy. The national government didn't have the authority to draft people into armed forces. And so again, the national government was simply too weak, and having the states have all the power was not working to achieve these goals. Promote the general welfare is a reference to the economy. Allowing each state to govern itself was leading to a lot of what today we might call trade wars, a lot of protectionism. States were not trading with each other because they wanted to protect their own domestic producers. And this was leading to negative impact on the economy overall, leading to impacts on the availability of goods across the country and leading to harm to the national economy overall. So they wanted a new constitution that would allow the national government to establish rules for trade that would promote the well-being of the nation and not allow states' competition with each other to harm not only eventually each individual state, but the nation as a whole. And then lastly, securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. You might think to yourself, well, if the king's rule is gone, and if the national government doesn't have very much power, what threat to liberty could there be? What threat to the freedom of speech, to the religious liberty, to people's protection against imprisonment without trials? Who could be the threat to our liberty? And the answer, of course, under the Articles of Confederation, was that the threat to liberty was the state governments themselves. You didn't have one uniform set of rights and liberties for the American people. Instead, you had each state deciding what rights and liberties it would have. The states were deciding citizenship. States were deciding who could vote. States were deciding whether you got a trial by jury. States were deciding, and you had a very crazy quilt of conceptualization of the rights and liberties of the American people under the Articles of Confederation. So one of the goals of the framers was to create a new national system of government that would nationalize liberties, that would ensure that people, regardless of where they lived in the United States, they would all share the same rights, the same liberties. So this is an introduction to, again, the problems under the Articles of Confederation. And the preamble tells us that the Constitution was intended to fix those problems and at the same time promote the common values of our democratic ideals.